It is with great pleasure that I welcome two courageous leaders, and they might describe themselves as recovering entrepreneurs, to help us kick off Global Entrepreneur Week and explore this theme of courage. So I'd first like to welcome Dr. Pippa Grange. Welcome, Pippa. I first came across Pippa on a Brene Brown podcast, Dare to Lead, when she was talking about her book, Fearless, How to Win Your Way in Work and Life. And from the moment she spoke, I lent in. I heard about her courage to be the first in her family to go to university and then pursue a master's and a doctorate in sports psychology. I heard about her courage to move halfway around the world and to do work in some of the most masculine, high-pressure environments like Australian rules football to help shift culture to be more soulful and inclusive. And I thought, this is brave stuff, really brave stuff. And then when she talked about her work to bring soul, love, and compassion into a place as supercharged as the England men's football locker room, I thought, I need to learn from this woman. So Pippa, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Maggie. It's lovely to be with you, and thank you for inviting me into this wonderful community. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. And then I'd like to introduce our second guest, Martin Kalungu-Banda. Welcome, Martin. So Martin and I met in the times before COVID, and you have to excuse me, I'm actually getting over COVID, so apologies. But in the times before COVID, Martin and I sat next to each other at a dinner in Berlin with a group from the Presencing Institute, where Martin is the leader of their African practice. And what I remember about that night, Martin, was your just incredible smile, your warmth, and your ability to tell great stories. And so when we invited you to join today, you just said yes straight away, but not even knowing quite what we'd asked you to do. And this is just the way that Martin leads from his heart. And then when we explained it a bit more, the penny dropped and Martin said, I used to be an entrepreneur, and then went to tell this incredible story about being the chief of staff for the president of Zambia, his native country. More on that story in a minute. But in addition to his work with Presencing Institute, which I love to think of as this kind of action learning lab for systems change, Martin also researches and teaches business ethics at Oxford and MIT. So welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I am super delighted to be here, but also having the opportunity to learn from Pippa. I look forward to the conversation.
Well, me as well. I mean, this is, we are a learning community at the League. So this is all about learning and really having this conversation, as we were just talking about, in service of all of you who have shown up today. So I'd love to start by just giving you each an opportunity to share about your own journey and kind of your perspectives on this topic of courageous leadership. And so maybe Pippa, if you want to kick us off by just sharing a bit about, what is courageous leadership to you? Why in this moment, why are we talking about it now? And then any kind of personal experiences you'd like to bring in.
Sure. I think the first thing I would say, Maggie, is that courageous leadership to me is a practice. It's not something that you perfect and have then never have to think about again. It's absolutely a practice. It's a learnt and continually learning and evolving practice. But I think that the heart of it for me is a courageous leader is somebody who can show up as their whole self. I've been thinking a lot about performance for the last 25 years, but particularly about the way that the performer in us actually gets in the way sometimes of solving problems and facing challenges. And sometimes I think that when we show up in a workplace particularly, and we have that label of leader, we can actually be in a performance mindset. And when we're in that mindset too much, our ego gets involved. We start to try and manage the impression that we're making on other people. We try to control things. We maybe start protecting ourselves a little bit or withdrawing a little bit from the tougher conversations, and we've invited fear in. So I think that when we can really show up as the whole human mess that we are, gorgeous mess that we are, and be willing to talk about what we don't yet understand as well as what we do, be willing to ask for help as well as offer it, and be willing to stand true in your own shoes at this moment as a leader, then I think that the opportunity for courage is there. And for me, courageous leadership really requires a lot of generosity to self and to other. You know, as you pointed out, Maggie, it comes from the word heart. Core is the sort of original essence of that. And to bring generosity into leadership is really powerful. But first we have to embody who we actually are, and not the image or the impression that other people might have of us. So I think that's sort of, you know, a small encapsulation of how I would see courageous leadership. Why is it important at the moment? I think perhaps this time it is unique, but it's not the first time we've had a lot of difficult messages to take on about the way that the world's changing. But what's happening at the moment is the world seems to be changing in ways that we don't understand or we can't control. And what that does to us as human beings is moves us to our own extremes. Fear moves us to our own extremes, and to the edges and margins. And we become divided. And I think that we would probably, I imagine your community here would agree that this is a time of division, and what we actually need is unity and the courage to lead generously from the heart, vulnerably, and to be able to say, I don't really know what to do next, but let's work it out together. I think that is enormously powerful at a time where we are feeling fractured and unsure, and there is so much ambiguity and change around us. So that's why I think it always matters, but perhaps right now it's vital rather than just desirable. And to Maggie, you asked about my own journey. I thought about this from the perspective of courage, and I have a very recent example that actually took some courage for me, and that is the courage to stop. So I have worked in an elite sports environment for the last 25 years, and that environment is one where the cultural context is always relentlessly pushed to the line. It's a never stop, take the opportunity, make it happen, no finish line kind of mentality is underpins elite sport. And sometimes you can completely disconnect from your body. And Maggie, as you and I said in a previous conversation, your body actually becomes like a taxi cab for your brain, taking you through life. And you don't realize until, or you continue to compromise, even if you do realize, continue to compromise yourself when you're getting burnt out. That's what happened to me this year recently. And I had to actually, a very inconvenient timing in the middle of a huge, wonderful growth period in my organization and lots going right, and I didn't feel okay. And I had to put my hand up and say, I don't feel okay. And that really took some courage for me, because I felt I was going to put weight on other people where I'm used to taking the weight. I felt that I was letting people down. I felt that there was an opportunity on the table that I wasn't going to be able to make happen for people. And there was a sense of failure about it that I really had to reckon with. So that took me quite a bit of courage to stop and to listen to my body instead of letting it be a taxi cab, and recognize that I wasn't feeling right and I was unwell mentally and physically and needed a breather. So, instead of becoming cynical and fantasizing about laying on the forest floor and sleeping for a year, I actually decided to do something about it and said, I need to stop for a minute. And that's what I've been doing. So it's a small example of localized courage for me recently.
But thank you so much for sharing that very personal story about courage. And that, I mean, I know so many listening today working, they work in these institutional environments that don't sound very dissimilar to elite sport. This just go, go, go. And especially right now, with the economy in such a place of uncertainty and, recession looming, there's just so much focus on, the numbers at the cost of the human. So, just so appreciate you sharing that, because I know it will resonate for a lot of people listening. And this idea that's courage, not necessarily to move forward, right? It isn't always about doing that next thing, but maybe it's about stopping something. And I love too how you talk about gorgeous mess. I think that's cool. Like Odette's going to be, on social media here, and I should remind everybody, please do be putting questions in as you're hearing things and things come up, because we will be coming to audience later. But things like gorgeous mess, I just think is exactly it, right? It is a courage to kind of admit we don't know everything, right? And to stand comfortably in the discomfort, which is hard. So thank you for sharing that. I want to bring Martin in, and then we'll get the conversation going. But Martin, please, would love to hear kind of your thoughts as well on courageous leadership. Why now, and maybe an example of that's come up for you on your own journey.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I am helped by how people describe what courageous leadership is for her, and that resonated with me as a practice. Because for me, courageous leadership is that experience. Maybe it's even a feeling or sensing a call to intervene, a call to act, a call to show up, like people said, in a particular way. And as you are experiencing that, you are in the same moment experiencing the feeling of being too small, too inadequate for the task that is pulling you. You know there is a pull, and yet you experience yourself very little. And at the same time, you can not do. It's almost like you have lost the freedom to say no. It's almost like you can't help but lean into the same thing before which you are feeling small and inadequate. It's almost a contradiction in its saying, and we do all recognize it. You could tell from the way people was describing that moment of things are working, and yet I have to come in there and say, guys, I got to stop. But there are times also when indeed things are working well. It's your job now to make that little contribution, and you don't feel worthy enough to do that. Why now? In living memory, we have probably not read about, not seen the confluence of things that require so much courageous leadership. On the one hand, we see a divided world, and a divided world at national level, at community level. Look at the United States. You would think you could easily have two countries. Look at where we are in Europe, and the war raging in our backyard. We haven't even spoken about the fact that we are living this close to destroying ourselves environmentally. We have done enough damage for the place we live on to hit back at us and annihilate us. We haven't mentioned the evolution of the pandemics that are just evolving and will continue to evolve. That requires courage. Courage in the manner Maggie described it, and people complimented that. Because it comes from this, which is on the left side of our chest, the heart, both figuratively, and I suspect I'm no biologist, no scientist as such, but there is enough traditional wisdom that tells us that which is on the left side of our chest is not just a blood pumping machine. It has the capacity to pick a lot of reality, a lot of truth before the fifth servant of the brain gathers that. And there is such thing as collective heart, just as there can be collective brain. What might we be able to access that which is in the future so that we can begin to behave differently now if we strengthened this collective heart? And that's the reason why this conversation matters. We are living in unprecedented times. Yes, immense opportunities, but those come with immense responsibilities, and we haven't figured ourselves out of that. Just look at the simple example of how employer-employee are struggling. How do we come out of the pandemic? We learned how to work from home. Now we need to come back to the office. No, do we come back to the office when we can actually perform highly back home? And we are in the process of learning. But to do that, we need the courage in the manner people was describing. In my own little life example, which you alluded to, Maggie, some years back when I worked for the Zambian government, and I was serving the third president of Zambia, special consultant to the president, helping him to reestablish the position of chief of staff in the presidency. And it was my job to be there not because I knew better than he did, but to be there as a mirror through which he could bounce his own thoughts, feelings, so that he could make decisions for the country, for the people that elected him. But also I was working in a culture where we bow before leaders. And in this particular case, he wasn't just head of state. He was also a very successful lawyer in his previous life. So he had proven himself. He was also physically gifted. He was tall and elegant. So he beat you in every way. And one morning I had to share with him that each time he spoke against the first president of the country, Kenneth Kaunda, the public out there didn't like it. And I plucked enough courage to tell him. He was polite in the first response. He said, "Martin, I respect many things about you, but you don't understand politics. Can we talk about something else?" I felt the urge to stay with the topic I had started introducing. I slightly stressed my point and I said, "Your Excellency, could you just give me a bit of time? I think people out there don't like you each time you speak against the first president." And then he elevated his voice and said, "I've told you, shall we talk about something else?" I felt something within me say, "Hang in there." And I said, instead of saying something, I stood up and knelt before him, leaning forward, and said, "For God's sake, can you hear me?" He said to me, "Stand up and get out of my office." It was only when I was walking out of the office that I thought, what if he interpreted that as an attack, physical attack? Because I stood up and then moved forward, and then I said, "For God's sake, hear me." I went to my office and I sat there trembling. My secretary kept coming in and out and asking, "You don't seem to be working. Is everything fine?" I pretended everything was fine. And after an hour, the phone that only rang when it was the president calling rang, and I answered, and he said, "Can you come back to my office at once?" With my notepad and a pen, as per tradition, I walked back to his office. And then he said, "So what would you like me to do?" I saw a window opening, and I thought I could slot myself there in his service. So I said, "Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Would you consider apologizing to the first president?" He went silent. And then When he next spoke up, he said, okay, could you go and draft the letter? Pippa, Maggie, I again, in that moment, thought there was something I didn't expect, a little window opening. I stood still, as if I hadn't heard him. Then he said, did you hear me? I said, yes, sir. Then go and draft the letter. Then, as politely as I could mobilize my energy, I said, Your Excellency, I didn't insult the first president. You did. I can write bureaucratic language. It will sound not sincere enough. Would you kindly dictate the words that would constitute your apology? He looked at me and said, why are you being difficult? I stood in silence. He dictated the words. I went back to my office, typed, brought back. He endorsed his own words, printed on the final copy. When he signed, as if to punish me, he said, please do not give the letter to the messengers. Can you take the letter yourself? And I said, yes, sir. And as I was about to leave, he asks me the next question. He says, you must be happy now. And I swear something I hadn't planned for shot up. I turned and I said, more or less, Your Excellency. He says, what do you mean more or less? I said, would you consider when I'm with the first president that I call you so that you can also speak in voice? And then my president asked me a strange question. He says, do you think he would accept my call? I said, you are the head of state. He would not say no. He said, yes. I arrived at the first president, gave him the letter. And as he was reading the letter, tears were running down his cheeks. And then I asked, your brother president asked me if he could speak to you. He also asked me the same question. Are you sure he would really want to speak to me? The end of the story there was they spoke. I came back to report to the president. And the president said, you must be finally happy. And I said, I am close to being happy, Your Excellency. What does close mean to being happy? I said, you and the first president have reconciled. You spoke against him, what has been termed as insulting him at a public rally. So the two of you have healed. The nation has not. Would Your Excellency consider a public apology? And he said, that won't happen. I knew I had pushed too many doors. I thanked him and went to my office. A week later, he called and said, Martin, can you ask our press secretary to arrange a press conference? I want to reshuffle cabinet. Press conference was arranged. He reshuffled cabinet. And in the last 3 minutes, then he said, countrymen and women, I want to emphasize that none of us has the right to take away the position of father of the nation for our first president. And I must apologize, having been the first person to try and do that when I had when I addressed a rally in Livingston. I hope you will find it in your hearts to forgive me. And he ended the press conference. Close to midnight, my phone rang and the president said, Martin, my phone hasn't stopped ringing since the press conference. Everybody is saying that's how a statesman behaves. You are helping to unite the country. And at that time, my job was to say, congratulations, Your Excellency.
Wow.
The little windows that I never planned for, and I could see them come through. And I knew inside me the trembling, but then there was room for me to ask the next question. And the next question.
Wow. I mean, Martin, thank you so much for sharing that story. And I just hear so much in that, and people would like to bring you back in as you're listening to Martin's story. I mean, there's Martin, when you speak about this story to others, there's something you talk about that's very physical or almost metaphysical. I mean, you talk about your heart and this sensing, sensing that I had to act, even though you were kind of small relatively. And it sounds like physically, a really big guy, incredibly powerful. So there's something about that. I'd love you to just kind of talk about this. And you also mentioned it, Pippa, your body kind of telling you what needed to happen. So I'd love to hear a bit more of that. And also this powerful moment where the two statesmen are asking, would this person accept my call? It's just this reminder that our CEOs, our presidents, our traditional leaders are human beings, and that fear is present there as well. So I know, Pippa, you've also worked with, heads of, many organizations. So maybe it's kind of two different things, but this kind of physical embodiment of and sensing a moment for courage, and then also recognizing, the fear taking place at the highest levels, even of our organization, or anything else you want to come in. But those were at least two things that really stood out, Martin, as you were sharing that.
Yeah. Firstly, Martin, what a gorgeous story. Thank you for sharing that. It really reminded me that we teach people how to treat us. And when you were gracious with him and you understood where not to push and when to retreat, and when you kept love in your heart as you engaged with him, he was able to do the same. When we exchange in conflict, when we exchange like that, we're exchanging energy. We're always exchanging energy. And, in that moment, with somebody who is in such a powerful position in relation to you, you exchange the energy of care, service, love, but also maintain your authority without having to meet power with an aggressive form of power. And therefore, you demonstrated that's so right, that we do teach people how to treat us. And you gave him an opportunity to find his best version in doing that way. And I think that's what it's true, Maggie, leaders also feel pressure all the time. Sometimes when we're in the middle of an organization, it's so easy in this sort of cultural context of division. They're the bad guys. They're the ones who are not listening to us. They're not opening the right doors or putting the right resources. But they're under different kinds of pressure, perhaps. And it's really easy to be, as Chimamanda talks about, that to go to a single story about the boss, and that she or he is not hearing or not willing or has a different agenda. Maybe they also feel fear. Maybe they also need to be enabled and encouraged through heart to open up to a little bit more courage themselves. Encouraged, it's the same word. So I think that's really important when we're talking about leaders, to recognize their common humanity. This stuff happens for all of us. Fear is not selective. And the stronger the power dynamic, I think the more the door is open to fear, and the more present and conscious and open-hearted we have to be to helping somebody, to encourage somebody to move beyond it, or to reflect and step themselves. So I love that idea of recognizing what you felt in your body, and that idea of sort of when you feel small, and this is sort of looming great challenge in front of you, feel small or inadequate to the task. For me, I think something I have found so useful is to think about participation rather than solving. That was an act of participation that you made there with your president. It was an act of participating in him having a good outcome, him doing well, the country being served. And instead of sort of, leadership or heroic endeavor being seen as something ginormous, sometimes it's a small act of participation, and that's courage and courageous leadership. So I love that, and I'm really grateful you shared that with us.
I think
Maybe did I also? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just asking if I'd caught your question there as well.
Yeah, great. And we've also got some coming in the chat, which I'll try to bring in here. But this idea of participation, right? I mean, so many people. I mean, I hear it all the time in the league and with entrepreneurs, this us versus them. You know, so you talk about it on kind of a national scale, like in America, but this happens within our workplaces, right? It's like they don't get it. They don't see it, you know, often like the CFO, and then there's the person working on climate change. And so this idea that you can come in not battling, right, not pushing, but coming in with generosity and trying to understand the pressures that they're on. And I guess I'd love to hear you both just talk maybe more practically about how to do that. And I guess, you know, the title of this session was about rewriting the hero's narrative, right? So there is this sense of, you know, we have these so many stories, and we're going to talk later today also about the hero's narrative and the stories that we tell ourselves about courage, that courage looks like, you know, the knight on the white horse, or that, you know, the kind of person swooping in to save the day. And, you know, what Martin's story of courage is very different from that, right? This generosity, you know, this is not somebody swooping in to save the day. And somebody else made a comment in the chat about, I don't actually feel courageous. I just show up as myself.
Right.
But actually, in these contexts we're talking about, to show up as your, as you said, whole self, wholehearted, that's an act of bravery, right?
I think when we feel courage, when we feel fear, we become more conformist. You know, there's a real poverty in conformity when it comes to our imagination, when it comes to sort of our creativity, our ability and will to find a different way, because we get annoyed, we get irritated, we get activated by fear. We become more self-doubting, more illogical, more judgmental, less likely to see the good and focus on the bad. We feel it steals our joy. We feel more limited in what we can achieve. But no circumstance has changed from 10 minutes before, except you have allowed more fear into the room, or more fear has come into the room. So, you know, being willing to reorient, to see what's happening and reorient yourself to say, okay, there's fear here. Not I am fearful, but fear is here. How will I respond to that? I think it's just really, really useful in that context. And I love what you're saying, Maggie, about battle narratives. I feel so strongly about this. Language and symbolism are extraordinarily powerful in the way we go about our work. You think about how often when we're talking about what we're working on, we talk about the struggle or the fight or the, you know, what we have to conquer or get over, or, you know, there's so much battle narrative in the way that we speak, warring narrative, and it's the opposite of the left side of the chest, as you say, Martin. So, you know, I really invite people to rethink some of the way that they use language in their work, because that language is one of those exchanges of energy. It's one of those things that sets the tone on how the tough conversation you're trying to have will go. You know, it's so much more than our words, but our words open the door. So yeah, I think that's a really important part of creating the kind of psychological space we need to be more creative in our conversations. And I'm very happy to talk about heroes when we get to that too, Maggie.
Martin, do you want to come in?
And just picking it from Pippa's line, the psychological space, but looping that back to the notion of practice, I find I need to practice before the moment happens. And I have no idea what that moment is. Sometimes I do have an idea, but what is the practice that enables me to be ready for those moments that require my courage, our courage? In this particular case I was talking about with the president, there was a non-general role that I was going into, but I wanted to be ready. So two things I did was I requested that I delayed my appointment by a week because I wanted to go on silence. I wanted to go on a retreat. I knew I hadn't learned how to support a head of state anywhere in my life. The closest was to work for a chief executive of an oil company. But serving a head of state was a completely different ballgame. I requested that I went on silence. I wanted to go and sit there, partly because I had come across the notion of how to get yourself out of the way when you are in service, that you can be the hindrance to the job, to the role, to the task you are being invited to perform. People refer to that as ego, and I think you also, Maggie, did. Then the ego stands there, your own importance stands in the way. Then you lose sight of these little lines of opportunity that are constantly calling to use you as a small instrument in the bigger picture of things, in the bigger scheme of things. And I thought that silence could. The second thing was when I arrived at State House, then I requested the president, sir, is there a chance that you could swear me in? You have to swear in private. And then he said, oh, no, Martin, I need to check the law. You cannot be sworn in private. And why would you want to be sworn in private? I said, because public attention will distract me from serving. I want to be this little fly in your system that is doing the job that it was invited to do, and not so much the attention of the public, because being sworn in by the head of state is a big, massive public event. Media is there. And then the following day, he came back and said, I've sorted out your issue. Public has been defined as myself and two other people. So I will invite the secretary to cabinet and one of my advisors, and we will form public. And that's how I was sworn in public, private. I think those two elements supported me. But when I also listen to people, it is whatever we do in order to strengthen that muscle from which we spring when moments of opportunity or danger or frustration arise. I do not think I am capable of just in the moment springing up and using myself as an instrument meaningfully if I do not have the backroom work that I need to do, whatever that is for different people.
Martin, I love that. I mean, thank you for bringing that, right? It's, as you said, you opened up about this as a practice, right? If you think of any kind of practice that it's intentional, that we're cultivating, whatever it is, how to have an open and honest conversation, right? And I guess seeing, and you're talking about taking moments for contemplation, right? Really tuning into yourself. And I think what you're bringing too is this point about fear, Pippa, is so important because many of us work in cultures that, whether it's intentional or not, there is a lot of fear present. And so this point that fear kind of pushes us to conform, which is such a deficit, right? It doesn't then invite us to bring all the stuff we're saying, the wholeheartedness, the diversity, the new ideas, the bravery, the whatever it is, So I kind of want to just, because we only have a few minutes left, so do kind of bring in any last points as well, but I'd love to just talk about the culture and the system for a minute, because one of the things with the league when we reflected kind of several years in is that, with entrepreneurs, there is a bit of a hero's narrative that we've been promoting, right? It's like, okay, you got your cape on, we're going to arm you up with all the, the tools and the superpowers, and, you're going to go and fight the good fight, and you're going to, climate change and equity, and we're in, and there is this narrative that I think is kind of seeped from the social entrepreneurship world into social entrepreneurship, that isn't really serving us. And also we're working in these environments that can be quite fear inducing. And so like, how do we, if I'm sitting in an organization as an entrepreneur, I can only work on myself so much, right? But there's then this system around me. So how do we start collectively kind of shifting that? What does that look like? And I think, Martin, you brought in this beautiful world of this kind of collective heart. right? What does it actually practically look like to act with like a collective heart in an organization? If you have thoughts on, again, remembering that most of these people are sitting in kind of the middle of the organization, and really thinking about how can we create a space that is less fearful or fear-inducing.
For me, I think, I love this idea of sort of moving beyond the hero narrative, because a hero is something momentary. A hero is called to the fore when there is a crisis, where there needs to be something, there's a solitary, unique moment that needs to be addressed, but it's not a sustainable way to work or live. All right, that's sort of the nobody, even Superman doesn't wear the cape all the time, right? He comes out in his Clark Kent sometimes. Right, so I think sometimes we've talked ourselves into having to be superhuman when what we most need is just human, all the gorgeous mess of human and humanity, and finding our respective niches in an organization. Like any ecosystem, an organization is the same. We have niches. What niche is there to fill? And, I've been thinking about other types, other sort of archetypes or sort of species in an ecosystem that can work instead of the hero, that are super powerful. And I was thinking about, the healer, which can be that the healer can be about the person who does bring the human touch to the room, to the conversation, does sort of bring service and the sense of compassion into the conversation. That's actually a healing archetype. Or maybe it's the sage, the original Yoda, and that's a person who tries to work on understanding and things like strategy and how does people see the whole picture. That's a sage archetype, very different to a hero who's on a solitary individual quest. The sage is only useful to a community. Or maybe it's the architect, engineer, builder, like the bee or the ant in their ecosystem. And that's somebody who's a method maker and a designer, somebody who's working on the how. And in the middle of an organization, that person is just a vital pulse, somebody who's working on the how. Because as we talked about leaders being scared, sometimes they're also overwhelmed. What they need is a simple path forward on how. Maybe it's also the dot joiner. I love this. I think maybe I've been a dot joiner in my life. And that's somebody who focuses on belonging, connection, sense maker, maybe community maker to a degree as well, but somebody who's joining the dots so you can see the whole picture. There's the artisan, innovator, bar raiser, maybe the person who's inspiring through the art of their work or the craft of their work. The explorer, adaptation, possibility, the person who asks what else, instead of us getting stuck here, what else? Such a powerful question, what else? And to include other people and to be able to say, I think the explorer also has to say, I don't know the next, I don't know the next territory. I need to explore with other people. I need to bring in others to collaborate to get there. It doesn't have to be solitary. And then another one that I've heard so many times in football teams, sometimes where there's a player who's a real disruptor, cultural disruptor, they're referred to as an enzyme. So the person who comes in and really changes something, their chemistry changes something in the team, in the room, so they're a catalyst for change. And sometimes that's quite disruptive. It might be explosive disruptive, or it might be slow disruptive, but it's disruptive. And I think in the middle of organizations we can really think of ourselves as enzymes sometimes, of like, how are we the Imagineers of what else might happen, but also how are we the ones who disrupt the status quo a little bit, like an enzyme does in a system. So lots of other ways of being other than the caped, solitary hero, because the hero is carrying a tremendous burden on their own. And I think that's exhausting. And there are moments for heroes that we desperately admire and through our collective history, and that we revere, but it's not a daily way to live or work, because we'll all be laying on the forest floor having a nap.
Exactly. And just a note, we'll be exploring that topic later today with Catherine Connor, so please join us for that workshop. So I'm conscious we're nearly at time. We've got about 2 more minutes. So I'd just love for each of you to kind of wrap with maybe some very just practical advice for folks. So if they're going to go back, maybe later today or tomorrow or the next day, thinking about that courageous action, whether it's the conversation up the chain, whether it's showing up as more vulnerable, they're going to be reflecting on, how do I show up with more courage in my context? So any advice or kind of final thoughts you'd leave with our entrepreneurs today? So maybe, well, jump in when you feel moved to do so. Martin, if you.
Listening to Pippa speak, I do hear her when she talks about the multiple roles that we can show up through. But also for me, it includes the realization that the work that entrepreneurs are called to do is not a game of lone rangers. Mm. The wicked challenges we face in our organizations, in our communities, in our nations, and globally, they have little or no respect for lone rangers. Yes, feel the pull, feel the call, but immediately begin to see who else can I hold hands with. Heroes going in the future won't be in individual character. It is in our collectiveness. And the more we can develop that capacity to feel the pull at a personal level, but immediately begin to see who else can I hold hands and hearts with in order to shift the dial, to shift the game. The era of lone rangers is long gone.
I agree with that 100%, Martin. The quality and character of the relationships that we have and the solidarity and unity that we can develop is what will take us forward. I really agree with that. One other thing that I would offer to the audience in thinking about just practical things is to really consider intensity. Like, can you ground a little bit and let go of some of the intensity so that you can keep a deep balance for what is difficult work? Sometimes where our egos and our personalities and our gorgeous mess gets involved, we do this a lot. Can you ground and let go of some intensity so that you just have the intensity where it's really needed? Yeah. And alongside that, I would also say, I study something called ecological psychology. And one of the principles of that is about compost. There's no waste in nature, but there's lots in human nature. And, what is it that you're hanging on to that you could let go and let compost so that there can be fertile soil for the next thing? Mm-hmm. What do you need to actually let go of, whether it's resentment, frustration, anger, a plan that didn't go the way you wanted it to, or that you haven't been able, a task that you haven't been able to get over the line? What can you compost to make some more space?
Oh, those are beautiful final words. And I'd love to keep going, but we're going to let our audience get to the next sessions. But just, I loved hearing about courage as a practice, right? That we can all continue and must be continuing to develop, right? It's not just a moment, but a practice that's about being wholehearted and showing up as our authentic selves, standing in our shoes and our reality and our truth in this gorgeous mess. And that there are no more heroes, right? There's no lone rangers anymore in this. There are co-travelers, there's collective hearts, there's community, there's relationships. And I just really love this idea and this invitation of courage to let go, right? And what can we compost to create the fertile ground for something new to emerge?